A wise, very successful man once told me to ensure success in the future, we need more women as CEOs and more men as chairmen, meaning more women in the driver's seat while men move up, making more room for us chicks at the top of the daily decision-making tree. A wise, very successful woman once told me that we don't need mentors, women need a seat at the table. Both of these people are pragmatic Aussies who I think offer up interesting ideas for private and public sectors to take on board. But since the explosion of racial tensions in the US recently and the economic fallout from COVID begins to hit home, it feels that 2020 has sped everything up, including how to solve a problem like systemic inequality. Some brands have come under fire for being vocal about racism and gender disparity on social media. It takes nothing to post a black square to Instagram with a hashtag. For the truly radical, show us your org chart. Over the past couple of days, we've seen a number of media organisations and publications undertake audits into the makeup of their teams. Many high-profile editors and leaders have resigned or stepped away from their businesses for not doing enough to increase visibility or minorities or encouraging equal opportunity workplaces. There is even talk that Anna Wintour, the long-standing editor of Vogue, is set to be ousted from Condé Nast after the company was criticised for not supporting diversity in the office or through the glossy, aspirational content it publishes. Is this virtue signalling, or is it time to make long overdue changes into our institutions and businesses? This will ultimately lead into a discussion of quotas favoured by organisations like the Labor Party here. But installing people into high-profile positions for the sake of their sex or skin colour is just plain insulting. When it comes to creating real change, can we please do away with things like women's power brunches or panels that charge up-and-comers $100 or so just to hear from successful people talk about their lives? Instead of a goodie bag, offer us and them a foot in the door. We need more women and more diversity, aiming for middle management first, because parachuting people into jobs they may not be ready for is only setting them up for failure. So Daisy, what are your thoughts on this? Do you enjoy a bit of a power brunch where we can hear about the sisterhood and how we can all be better? Or do you think that it is time that we need to really take a long, hard look at our institutions and really get people to open up and say it's time for quotas when it comes to women and people of ethnic minorities?
Well, look, I agree with you entirely on the subject of women's power brunches, and I certainly I agree with you when you say that, you know, catapulting people into jobs they're not ready for, CEO positions, etc., purely on the basis of their race or their sex is insulting. It is incredibly demeaning, I think. Now, I tend to be a bit of an individualist on this issue. I don't tend to view sort of diversity, race, sex, gender, etc. as sort of the defining kind of characteristic of a person. So I've never really bought the kind of alarm that goes with this sort of diversity push, gender quota push, etc., etc. I mean, for me, if I don't actually care who's doing the job so long as they're providing me the best possible service. I mean, having said that, though, I think what goes missing a lot from this discussion is what you'd call a sort of time lag. I mean, I had a look before the show. The average age in Australia for people to be just appointed as a CEO, so the baby CEOs, is 47. You know, that is, you know, right, almost heading into your 50s, you know. So I think what we see at the top now, you know, the makeup of CEOs, which tends to be sort of Anglo-Saxon men, that's more of a reflection on the past, I think, rather than sort of what's currently going on. I mean, if you look at what's going on now, say, with women in education, I mean, about 60% of university graduates in Australia are women. I mean, that's monumental, you know, and certainly let's look at sort of a microcosm for a minute. Let's sort of look at the law profession in Australia. Just recently, it's been reported that 52% of solicitors in Australia now are women. which is, you know, one of the first times that's tipped to be more women, and certainly 60% of law graduates are also women. Now, they're still underrepresented at the top of the profession, certainly on the boards and in the top positions at firms. However, they are making up those kind of middle management ranks already. So in probably, you know, 10 to 20 years, we will actually start to see very tangibly, I think, the gains that we are making now, which is, you know, more women graduating university, tons more women going into STEM. There's a massive push to, not via affirmative action, just through encouragement and mentoring, to get women into more leadership positions. Because look, at the end of the day, social change takes a really long, like an astronomically long time. And if you think of the scale of human history, how far women have come in the last 50 years is absolutely meteoric. It is mind-blowing in the West when you consider the millennia of women who've been very much in a subjugated kind of position. So just, you know, rather than quotaing and pushing in these diversity blocks, et cetera, in the case of women, I think give it time. The gains are being made. You know, I think this will happen naturally. It won't need any kind of artificial sort of social engineering. That's just my view.
Yeah. Sarah, I guess, do you think that rather than quotas and things for women to enter middle management and then obviously climb the ranks into the C-suites, do you think more needs to be done at those levels to ensure that they have more flexibility in the workplace? Is that the type of thing we need to be focusing on as opposed to quotas?
I think flexibility is a big part of it, and I think that's going to be an interesting thing for male and female workers as we come out of this COVID environment. Certainly the couple of months that the country went into lockdown, I think, has seen flexibility become something that all workers have tapped into. I mean, obviously acknowledge that there's a lot of industries, of course, where that's simply not possible, but certainly for a lot of people in white-collar professions, we've seen employers having to review, certainly in my office, for instance, we actually felt a little bit chained to our desks in producing a magazine. But the fact that we've had to produce a magazine for 10 weeks with everyone working at their kitchen table, often with young children climbing over them while we were in that joy of homeschooling, I think has sort of proven that anything is possible. And I like to think that that will level the playing field, certainly for women, but also for men, because, you know, so many men feel that they have to be the ones that are seen in the office, still serving that very traditional role of breadwinner. And I just don't think that those strict gender stereotypes do anyone a service. I mean, look, I think Daisy makes that great point about 60% of university graduates in Australia. My concern is that that number does funnel when we're talking about those corner offices. We see these great figures. We know that there's so much goodwill and that there's so many talented women in the country, but it just comes down to that unconscious bias. I'm certainly not alleging that there's, you know, sinister people saying, close the door, she's a woman, we're never going to let her in the boardroom. But we know that there are some obstacles. And look, obviously quotas, I support them in some ways. I mean, I have to say, I think we're probably at a point where we do have to look at quotas in federal parliament. I think we've played the patient game long enough there. But look, there's a lot of factors. I mean, it's a very complex issue. But, you know, I think, Jenna, just finally, what you talk about there, you know, we want to make sure that we don't elevate women into two positions, not just for fear of being tokenistic, but in this very vulnerable economic environment. You've probably heard of the glass cliff. It's sort of the unfortunate spin-off of the glass ceiling, and that is where women are thrown into positions of power during times of economic downturn or crisis. And of course, they're destined for failure. So we certainly don't want to see that happen.
Yeah, for sure. Michael, as a token white male on this panel, what are your thoughts on this? Should quotas be introduced to things like federal parliament?
Should be introduced on a show like this. I mean, I'm feeling outnumbered. No, look, I'm against quotas. I think quotas are rubbish, to be blunt. I mean, in any seat, in any seat around the country, at least one of the political parties or an independent standing is a woman. I mean, basically. If this was such a big issue, then people would vote for that person on their gender. It's not, including for women. When it comes to politics, women, like men, like everybody else, of course, vote on the issues. And a lot of the women I know from all different age groups, more than happy to vote for a man to represent them in their seat, or a woman, as long as they're ideologically aligned with them. They don't care. So I'm not in favour of quotas. I don't think it's done the Labor Party much good either. I mean, you look at their political success record the last 50 years, it's abysmal. They've hardly ever won a thing. I think you've got to go back to the 1990s where they won, well, Kevin Rudd, but prior to that, the 1990s where they won an election in their own right. Quotas haven't done much for them, so I certainly wouldn't be pushing for that.